There was a time when the world's map looked nothing like it does today. A single empire rising from a small island in Europe would one day control nearly a quarter of Earth's surface and a quarter of its people. It began quietly, centuries ago, in the fog-covered lands of England. What started as scattered kingdoms and wooden castles would evolve into the most formidable empire humanity had ever seen, the British Empire. But behind its triumphs of exploration, invention, and global power lay a darker truth, one stained with greed, conquest, and blood. Long before the ships sailed across the oceans, England was barely surviving. It was the late 9th century when a king named Alfred, remembered as Alfred the Great, found himself cornered by a brutal Viking invasion. The Danes, under their fierce leader Guthrum, tore across the English countryside. Villages burned, families fled. Alfred, forced to abandon his court, hid deep within the marshlands of Somerset, seeking refuge in the swamps of Athelney. For months he lived there in isolation, listening to the wind whistle through the reeds. It was there, in that silence, that the foundation of a kingdom began to form. He gathered loyal soldiers, men who still believed in him, and forged a resistance. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Edington, where mud and rain turned the battlefield into chaos. Yet Alfred's troops pushed forward, breaking the Viking lines, forcing Guthrum to surrender. The peace that followed, sealed in the Treaty of Wedmore, carved England into two worlds: the Danelaw in the north, ruled by Vikings, and Alfred's own southern realm. But this fragile peace gave Alfred something far greater time. He reorganized his army, fortified towns, and dreamed of uniting all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. His dream would not die with him. It would live on through his descendants. His grandson, Athelstan, took the throne nearly half a century later. England was fractured rival kings in Northumbria, and Mercia challenged his rule. Yet Athelstan was not like other kings. He was strategic, relentless, and he saw the island not as divided territories, but as one land. In 927 AD, after a campaign marked by blood and diplomacy, Athelstan captured Northumbria. For the first time, England was one nation ruled under a single crown. He would be remembered as the first king of England, and the empire's first breath had begun. 2 centuries later, the island's ambitions stretched beyond its shores. King Henry II looked westward across the Irish Sea and saw opportunity. In the spring of 1171, Henry landed in Waterford with an army of knights clad in steel. Irish kings and chieftains watched as the English banners unfurled across their lands. Some resisted, but others, under pressure or persuasion, swore fealty to the English crown. When bishops and clergymen gathered at the Synod of Cashel, they bowed to Henry as Ireland's ruler. What no one realized then was that this would mark the beginning of England's first colony, the earliest seed of a global empire. A century later, that same hunger for control turned toward Wales. In 1277, King Edward I launched his campaign to bring the Welsh under English rule. His armies marched through rugged hills and forests, clashing with the fierce Welsh warriors led by Prince Llywelyn. Edward's soldiers built stone fortresses, massive, impenetrable walls that still stand today to hold the conquered land. One by one, Welsh strongholds fell. By 1282, after years of brutal conflict, Wales was annexed. English banners fluttered over the castles of Conwy, Harlech, and Caernarfon. The Celtic resistance faded, and Edward was satisfied for now. But history would not grant England peace. In 1337, it plunged into a century of bloodshed with France, the infamous 100 Years' War. What began as a dispute over succession turned into a relentless fight for dominance. Generations lived and died under its shadow. Soldiers who once farmed fields now marched beneath crimson banners, never to return. By the time the war finally ended in 1453, both nations were exhausted, their treasuries empty, their people broken. Yet before England could recover, another war began, one not fought against a foreign power, but against itself. The War of the Roses pitted two rival houses, Lancaster and York, against each other in a brutal struggle for the crown. From 1455 to 1487, England tore itself apart. Brothers killed brothers. Kings rose and fell. When the dust settled, the Red Rose of Lancaster triumphed, and Henry VII sat upon the throne. The wars had changed England forever. It had survived invasion, rebellion, and civil war. But outside its borders, the world itself was changing. In 1492, across the Atlantic, Christopher Columbus reached the Americas. News of vast new lands, rich with promise, spread like wildfire through Europe. Empires began to dream of oceans. Among them was England. When an Italian navigator named Giovanni Caboto approached King Henry VII with a bold plan to find a new route to Asia, the king saw an opportunity. Giovanni, soon known by his anglicized name, John Cabot, set sail from Bristol aboard the tiny ship Matthew. After weeks of storms and uncertainty, he sighted land the rocky coast of Newfoundland. Stepping ashore, he planted the English flag in unfamiliar soil. The wind howled across the cliffs as he claimed it for his king. What Cabot didn't know was that he had just given England its first claim in the New World, a spark that would ignite centuries of conquest. Back home, a new monarch had taken the throne, King Henry VIII. At first his reign promised stability, but as years passed, obsession consumed him, obsession with power, with legacy, and most of all, with a male heir. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, bore him only one surviving child, a daughter named Mary. Convinced that his lack of a son was divine punishment, Henry sought to annul the marriage. The Pope refused. The decision enraged him. What happened next would shatter Europe. In 1534, defying the Pope, Henry broke away from Rome and created the Church of England. The Act of Supremacy declared him the supreme head of this new church, giving birth to a faith that would define English identity for centuries. The monasteries were dismantled, their gold seized, and England, once the Pope's loyal servant, became his greatest defector. The Reformation had begun. After Henry's death, chaos followed. His daughter Mary, a devout Catholic, took the throne and unleashed a wave of executions to restore her faith. Her reign of terror earned her a name that would echo through time, Bloody Mary. But her rule was brief. When she died, her half-sister Elizabeth ascended the throne. Under Elizabeth I, England's golden age began. The year was 1559. The new queen declared England a Protestant nation once more, but her ambitions extended far beyond religion. Across the seas, the Spanish and Portuguese had carved empires out of South America, filling their coffers with gold and silver. France had settled in the north. England, small, isolated, and hungry, refused to be left behind. Elizabeth turned to a band of fearless privateers known as the Sea Dogs Men, who were part explorers, part pirates, and entirely ruthless. Their mission was simple: seize Spanish treasure and claim new lands for England. Among them was John Hawkins, a man who would forever stain England's history. In 1562, Hawkins sailed to the coast of West Africa. There he captured hundreds of Africans and crammed them into his ships. Weeks later, he sold them in the Caribbean for gold, pearls, and sugar. His voyages marked England's first steps into the transatlantic slave trade, a trade that would define its wealth and its guilt for generations. Despite the horror of his actions, Hawkins returned to England, celebrated as a hero, knighted by the Queen herself. Profit spoke louder than morality. Soon after, another sea dog, Francis Drake, set sail on a mission that would make him a legend. In 1577, he embarked on a daring voyage to circumnavigate the globe. His ship, the Golden Hind, faced monstrous waves and howling winds as it navigated the tip of South America. Drake raided Spanish ports, plundered gold, and discovered new lands along the coast of California, which he named Nova Albion. 3 years later, when he returned to England, the people hailed him as a national hero. The Queen herself knighted him aboard his ship. For the first time, the English truly believed they could rule the world. But power breeds enemies. In 1588, the most powerful monarch in Europe, Spain's King Philip II, assembled the greatest fleet the world had ever seen in the Spanish Armada. Over 130 ships and 30,000 men sailed for England, determined to end the Protestant reign. The English fleet, though smaller, was faster and better armed. As the Armada approached the Channel, English commanders like Drake and Charles Howard unleashed a strategy of chaos. They sent fireships into the heart of the Spanish formation, setting the night ablaze. Panic spread. Cannons thundered. The sea turned red. By the time the smoke cleared, the Armada was battered by English fire and North Sea storms. Philip's dream of conquest sank beneath the waves. England had survived, and in that survival, it found its destiny. The victory changed everything. No longer a vulnerable island, England began to imagine itself as something greater, a power ordained to rule not just its neighbors, but the world. Ireland was next. Once a proud and independent land, it became the target of English expansion. By the late 1500s, English settlers flooded into the island, seizing lands and enforcing their laws. Gaelic chieftains like Hugh O'Neill and Hugh O'Donnell rose in rebellion, determined to free their homeland. For nearly a decade, the 9 Years' War ravaged Ireland until the decisive Battle of Kinsale in 1601 crushed the rebellion. When peace was signed, Ireland's ancient culture began to vanish. The Gaelic tongue was suppressed, Catholicism outlawed, and the island was reshaped into an English colony. Ireland, like Wales and Scotland before it, was forced into submission. While Ireland bled, the English looked westward again to the New World. In 1606, King James granted a charter to a group of merchants known as the Virginia Company. Their goal? Find gold, silver, and a new route to the Pacific. In December, 3 ships, the Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, sailed from London, carrying 104 settlers. After months at sea, they reached the coast of what is now Virginia and founded Jamestown. The air was thick with humidity, and mosquitoes swarmed the swamps. Within weeks, disease and starvation claimed half the settlers. Their leader, John Smith, tried to trade with the local Powhatan tribes, but mistrust and violence followed. During the brutal winter of 1609, remembered as the starving time, colonists resorted to eating rats, roots, even the leather of their shoes to survive. Out of over 200 settlers, only 60 lived through the winter. And yet, somehow, the colony endured. When a young man named John Rolfe discovered that tobacco grew perfectly in the Virginia soil, everything changed. The plant became gold, and Jamestown began to thrive. Across the ocean, England was spreading its reach further still. In 1608, merchant William Hawkins arrived in India, meeting the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. Hawkins presented gifts from King James, and in return, secured England's first trading rights in Surat. 4 years later, the East India Company, once a small group of merchants, now had an official post on Indian soil. What began as trade would soon turn into conquest. And so the empire grew brick by brick, colony by colony. Each conquest began with a handshake, a promise of peace, or a flag planted on foreign soil. But behind every triumph were thousands of silent tragedies. From the cold marshes of England to the burning sands of Africa, a new order was being built, one that would soon engulf the world. Trade had given the English something they had never truly possessed before: leverage. The East India Company's flags began to appear on the coasts of Asia like quiet warnings. In the palaces of Agra, the Mughal emperors welcomed English merchants with cautious curiosity. No one could yet imagine that these polite visitors, with their wool coats and ledgers, would one day rule the entire subcontinent. By the year 1615, another envoy named Sir Thomas Roe arrived at Emperor Jahangir's glittering court. The Mughal court was a place of silks, jewels, and perfumes so rich they clung to the air. Roe brought gifts, but more than that, he brought ambition. He asked for trading rights, and the emperor, intrigued by these pale foreigners and their strange manners, granted them. It seemed harmless at first. A few warehouses, a handful of ships, and promises of peaceful exchange. But trade, as England understood it, was never just trade. It was the beginning of dominion. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the English were struggling to survive in their new colonies. The Mayflower sailed in 1620, its deck slick with salt and hope. The passengers, Puritans, exiles, and dreamers, believed they were chosen to build a holy city in the wilderness. They endured storms that cracked the ship's beams, illness that claimed their children, and the icy terror of an unknown world. When they reached the coast of New England and stepped onto frozen soil, they prayed rather than cheered. Plymouth Colony was born not from conquest, but desperation, and yet it too would grow into another brick in the empire's wall. In the Caribbean, England's ambitions turned darker. The lush islands shimmered in the sun, but beneath the sugarcane fields lay misery. On islands like Barbados and St. Kitts, entire populations were enslaved to feed Europe's appetite for sweetness. Ships packed with human cargo crossed the Atlantic in endless chains, men and women stolen from the coasts of Africa, traded like livestock. The sugar they harvested poured wealth into London, financing the rise of a new class, merchants who would soon become kings in everything but name. Back home, England itself was imploding. Kings and Parliament clashed, swords were drawn, and the soil of Britain drank its own blood once again. The English Civil War of 1642 ripped the nation apart. Cavaliers loyal to King Charles I faced off against the grim, disciplined soldiers of Parliament, led by Oliver Cromwell. The battlefields of Edgehill, Marston Moor, and Naseby echoed with cannon fire. Families were divided, churches destroyed. In 1649, the unthinkable happened. The king was executed by his own people. The monarchy was abolished, and Cromwell declared England a commonwealth under his rule. He called himself the Lord Protector, but many saw only another tyrant. To Ireland and Scotland, Cromwell brought fire and steel. In Drogheda and Wexford, his soldiers slaughtered thousands. Villages were burned, priests executed, and the Irish language itself was outlawed. Cromwell claimed he was bringing order and civilization, yet what he really brought was submission. When he died in 1658, the island was weary of endless war. The monarchy was restored soon after, and King Charles II took the throne. But England was no longer the same. It had tasted revolution and empire. Charles II looked beyond the ruins of civil conflict and saw opportunity abroad. He granted charters to companies with royal backing, the Royal African Company to control the slave trade, and the Hudson's Bay Company to seize the furs of North America. Every river, every coast, every port became a potential fortune. London's docks filled with ships bound for Africa, the Caribbean, and India. Goods and people moved in a cycle of cruelty and commerce. Gold, sugar, and human lives. Each had a price, and England intended to set it. By the end of the 17th century, English colonies dotted the map like constellations: Virginia, Barbados, Jamaica, New York, Bombay, and Madras. And yet behind the grandeur, cracks were beginning to form. The empire's strength came not only from its navy and muskets, but from belief that the English way was superior, ordained by God himself. That belief blinded them to the storm rising beneath their feet. In the early 1700s, the Act of Union bound Scotland to England under one parliament, creating the Kingdom of Great Britain. The name sounded noble, but for many Scots it meant betrayal. sold for gold and promises of trade. Still, the combined nation possessed new power. Together they built ships faster than any rival, crafted weapons stronger than any foe, and sent explorers to every corner of the earth. The empire was no longer a dream. It was a machine. Across the Atlantic, tensions simmered. Colonists who had once fled England for freedom now found themselves taxed and controlled by a distant crown. "No taxation without representation," they cried, as red-coated soldiers marched through colonial streets. It was a rebellion born from the very ideals England had once ignored. In 1776, 13 colonies declared themselves independent. The Declaration of Independence was not just a document, it was a mirror held up to the empire, showing its reflection twisted by greed and hypocrisy. When the war ended, the British watched the birth of the United States with a mix of disbelief and fury. They had lost the jewel of their Atlantic colonies, but not their appetite for control. If America was gone, they would turn east, where the riches of Asia waited. In India, the East India Company had already transformed from merchants to rulers. Its private army, larger than most European militaries, conquered territories in the name of trade. The company's officers lived like princes while famine consumed the land. In 1757, at the Battle of Plassey, the British defeated the Nawab of Bengal, seizing control of one of India's wealthiest regions. The victory was less a battle than a betrayal. Local allies bribed, loyalties bought. From that day forward, the company was India's new master. While muskets thundered in the east, explorers ventured south. In 1770, Captain James Cook charted the coast of a vast southern continent, Australia. To the British, it was a blank canvas. To the indigenous peoples, it was home. When the first fleet arrived in 1788 carrying convicts and guards, the soil of Sydney Cove became the foundation of a penal colony built on stolen land. The British called it progress. The natives called it invasion. By the dawn of the 19th century, the empire's reach stretched from the Caribbean to the Cape of Good Hope, from India to the Pacific. The sun never set on its flag, but in its shadow lay the millions who toiled for its glory. Britain called itself the beacon of civilization, yet it thrived on subjugation. Every colony told the same story: resistance crushed, languages erased, cultures rewritten. In 1805, Admiral Nelson defeated Napoleon's fleet at the Battle of Trafalgar, securing Britain's rule over the seas. From that moment, no empire could challenge its navy, but the power that protected them also tempted them. They began to draw new lines on the world map, lines that cut through mountains, rivers, and human lives. Africa, Asia, and the Middle East were divided in boardrooms thousands of miles away. In the East, rebellion brewed. The Indian sepoys, local soldiers serving the British, were tired of disrespect and exploitation. When the spark came in 1857, it spread like wildfire. Barracks erupted in flames, cities fell to chaos, and for a moment it seemed the empire might crumble. The British response was merciless. Villages were razed, rebels executed, and blood stained the Ganges. When it was over, the East India Company was dissolved, replaced by direct rule under the British Crown. Queen Victoria became Empress of India, and the Raj was born. In Africa, explorers and businessmen followed. They called it the Scramble, though for those who lived there it felt more like suffocation. Treaties were forged with one hand and broken with the other. By the late 1800s, Britain ruled Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and vast stretches of land from the Cape to Cairo. Every conquest came wrapped in the same lie, that it was for civilization's sake. The 20th century dawned on an empire at its zenith. Red shaded half the world map. London's docks swarmed with ships carrying tea from India, gold from South Africa, rubber from Malaya. But beneath the grandeur was a quiet dread. The cost of holding the world was beginning to outweigh the glory. The First World War shattered the illusion of invincibility. Millions of colonial soldiers fought and died under the Union Jack, believing their sacrifice would earn them freedom. When the guns fell silent in 1918, they returned home to find the chains unchanged. In India, voices rose again, this time led by a man who believed that freedom could be won not by the sword, but by the soul. Mahatma Gandhi's vision of peaceful resistance terrified the British more than any army. His marches, his hunger strikes, his refusal to hate, these things disarmed an empire built on fear. When the soldiers fired on the crowd at Amritsar in 1919, killing over 1,000 unarmed men and women, the world began to see Britain not as a liberator, but as an oppressor. The wound cut deep, and it never truly healed. 2 decades later, as Europe burned again in the fires of another world war, the empire strained to hold itself together. British soldiers fought across deserts and oceans, while the colonies supplied men, food, and resources. Victory came in 1945, but it was hollow. The war had drained Britain's wealth and will. The age of empire was ending, and nothing could stop it. In 1947, the jewel of the crown slipped away. India and Pakistan were born amid violence and partition, and the British departed quietly, leaving chaos in their wake. The empire began to unravel. One by one, nations claimed their independence. Ghana, Malaysia, Kenya, Jamaica, Nigeria. The red faded from the map. By the time Hong Kong was handed back to China in 1997, the empire existed only in museums and memories. What had once been a symbol of pride had become a reminder of cruelty and arrogance. From the stones of Jamestown to the palaces of Delhi, from the sugar fields of Barbados to the deserts of Egypt, the echoes of the empire still lingered, in languages, in borders, in the pain that refused to fade. The story of the British Empire is not a tale of good or evil. It is the story of humanity itself, of ambition and greed, of discovery and destruction. It began with a king hiding in the marshes of Somerset and ended with a flag lowered over Hong Kong. And as the sun finally set on the empire where it once never did, the world it built was left to ask a single haunting question: was it worth it? When the British Empire stood at its height, it was more than a political entity. It was a system of belief. Millions of people, from the halls of Westminster to the farthest corners of the colonies, believed that the empire was eternal. They believed that British order, British language, British law, and even British weather were blessings to be shared with the world. What they didn't realize was that the empire's greatest strength, its reach, was also its curse. It stretched too far, controlled too much, and relied on too many unwilling hands to keep it standing. The 1800s had been an age of relentless expansion. From India to Africa, from the Pacific Islands to the Middle East, Britain had become the spider in the center of a vast web. Ships carrying goods from Bombay crossed paths with those hauling wool from Australia and sugar from Jamaica. Coal mines in Wales powered steam engines that carried British weapons and railways deep into lands that had never known them before. On the surface, it was progress. Beneath it, it was control absolute and unrelenting. In London, the empire was celebrated like a living god. The Great Exhibition of 1851 displayed treasures looted from across the world: gold from Africa, silk from China, spices from India, and ivory from lands few Englishmen could even name. The Crystal Palace gleamed with stolen beauty. Visitors marveled at how small the planet seemed under Britain's shadow. Few asked what price was paid to fill those glass halls. In India, where the jewel of the crown glittered brightest, that price was blood. After the brutal suppression of the 1857 rebellion, the British Raj ruled through a mixture of fear and fascination. They built railways and schools, but not for the people, for the empire. British officers dined in marble halls, while Indian farmers starved outside their gates. The empire called it civilization. The people called it theft. Africa, too, was carved like a feast. At the Berlin Conference of 1884, the European powers sat around a map of the continent as though it were an unclaimed treasure chest. No African was invited to speak. The British delegates smiled politely as lines were drawn, lines that cut through ancient kingdoms, dividing tribes and rivers, slicing through lives. When the conference ended, Britain had claimed lands that stretched from Egypt to South Africa. They called it the Cape to Cairo vision, a chain of colonies that would link the north and south of the continent, like a golden spine. In those years, the British flag became a symbol of both wonder and dread. Missionaries preached in languages no one had heard before. Soldiers built forts on sacred ground. Railways appeared in deserts and jungles alike, not to connect people, but to move goods and troops faster. The empire's progress came with the sound of hammering steel and the silence of those it silenced. Even in its conquests, the British Empire justified itself with myths. It claimed to bring law where there was none, order where there was chaos, faith where there was darkness. But the reality was different. The law served the rulers. The order was enforced by the gun, and the faith was a flag sewn over every heart it conquered. By the late 1800s, rebellion simmered everywhere. In Africa, the Zulu fought with spears against British rifles. In Sudan, the Mahdi's army rose up to drive the British out. In India, whispers of independence spread through the universities and marketplaces. The empire's soldiers crushed every uprising with brutal precision. But they couldn't crush the idea that was growing stronger each year, the idea that people could rule themselves. Yet even as the empire tightened its grip abroad, it began to lose it at home. Industrialization had turned London into a city of smoke and sweat. Millions of factory workers lived in filth, while the empire's wealth flowed into the pockets of the elite. Children coughed on coal dust, while Parliament debated the ethics of conquering yet another country. The irony was bitter. A nation that ruled the world could barely feed its own. Then came 1914. It began with a gunshot in Sarajevo, one bullet that would drag the entire world into chaos. But for Britain, it was more than a war in Europe. It was the beginning of the end. When World War I erupted, the empire's reach became its burden. Soldiers from Canada, India, Australia, Africa, and the Caribbean were called to fight in a war they did not start. They marched through mud in France, froze in the Alps, and died in deserts they had never heard of. Over 1 million Indian soldiers fought for Britain in that war. Many never returned. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the empire had won, but it was hollow victory. The dead were too many, the debts too deep, and the faith too fragile. For the first time, colonies that had fought and bled for Britain began to question why. In India, the answer came in the form of a quiet man with a walking stick, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. He wore simple cloth and spoke softly, yet his words carried more power than any army. Gandhi's philosophy of non-violent satyagraha spread like fire through a dry field. When British troops opened fire on a peaceful crowd in Amritsar in 1919, killing over 1,000 men, women, and children, the illusion of benevolence shattered. The empire could no longer hide behind the mask of civilization. In the 1920s, the world began to shift. America and Japan were rising powers, and Europe was still scarred by war. Britain's colonies demanded more autonomy, more rights, more say in their own futures. The empire tried to adapt, granting partial self-rule to some, ignoring others, but the foundations were cracking. Then, in 1939, the world caught fire again. World War II pulled Britain into a nightmare it could barely afford to fight. German bombs fell on London night after night. Families hid underground, listening to the distant drone of engines above them. The empire's colonies once again sent soldiers and supplies, fighting under the same flag that denied them freedom. In Africa and India, in the Pacific and the Middle East, they fought not for empire, but for survival. By 1945, the Nazis were defeated. Hitler was gone. The war was over, but the Britain that emerged from it was not the same. The empire's coffers were empty, its ships damaged, its cities in ruins. The United States, once its rebellious child, was now the new global power. Britain was old, tired, and stretched thin, and in its exhaustion, its colonies saw opportunity. 2 years later, the unthinkable happened. The jewel of the crown, India, was gone. After nearly 2 centuries of control, Britain agreed to grant independence. But freedom came at a terrible cost. The partition of India and Pakistan divided a subcontinent along religious lines. Villages burned, trains ran full of corpses, and millions fled across borders that didn't exist a week before. In the chaos, an empire died, and 2 nations were born. From that moment, the fall of Britain's empire was no longer a matter of if, but when. In Africa, nationalist movements rose like storms. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah spoke of liberty and unity. In Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta demanded self-rule. Across the Caribbean, the rhythm of drums and the rise of voices called for independence. Each victory was another crack in the empire's armor. Yet even as the colonies broke away, Britain clung to its image of dignity. It called the process decolonization, as though it were an act of grace, not necessity. But history knew better. The empire wasn't giving freedom, it was losing control. By the 1950s and 60s, red was vanishing from the maps. The Union Jack, once a symbol of power, was being lowered in city after city: Accra, Kingston, Nairobi, Kuala Lumpur. The sun that had once refused to set on the British Empire was dipping below the horizon for good. Still, not every departure was peaceful. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising against British rule was met with brutal suppression. Camps were built, rebels tortured, thousands killed. In Cyprus, Malaya, and Aden, guerrilla wars dragged on for years. The empire was dying, but it refused to go quietly. The final act came decades later, halfway around the world. Hong Kong, the glittering city Britain had seized after the Opium Wars, was handed back to China in 1997. The rain fell softly as the Union Jack came down for the last time. Prince Charles stood silently, his expression unreadable. In that moment, 4 centuries of domination, expansion, and empire ended with a whisper instead of a roar. The story of the British Empire is the story of ambition turned to obsession. It began as a quest for survival, a small island defending itself from Vikings, and became a hunger that consumed half the world. It built ships that conquered oceans and railways that spanned continents, but it also built prisons, plantations, and graves. It gave the world Shakespeare and the steam engine, but it also gave it famine and chains. And perhaps that is what makes it so haunting. The empire was neither purely evil nor purely good. It was human, and therefore flawed. Its rulers believed they were chosen by destiny. Its people believed they were bringing progress. Yet behind every victory lay the sound of a language silenced, a temple destroyed, a people forgotten. Even now, the echoes remain. The English language dominates global trade. The parliamentary systems, the legal codes, the very borders of nations, all shaped by the long shadow of empire. The scars remain too in the poverty of former colonies, in the bitterness of partition, in the museums of London where stolen artifacts still gleam behind glass. The empire may be gone, but its ghosts are everywhere. They linger in place, names and accents, in monuments and minds. They whisper through the streets of London, where statues of old conquerors still stand, their stone eyes watching the world they once ruled. And though the sun has set, one question still hangs heavy in the air. did the empire build the modern world or break it. Empires rarely die overnight. They fade slowly, quietly, until one day they simply stop breathing. For Britain, the 20th century was not just the story of decline. It was the story of reckoning. The weight of its past had grown too heavy to carry, and the myth of moral superiority that had once justified everything from slavery to conquest was beginning to crumble. By the time Queen Elizabeth II was crowned in 1953, Britain was a nation still clinging to its former glory. The streets of London were still scarred from wartime bombing, but the royal coronation was televised a new empire of images replacing the old empire of land. Across the Commonwealth, millions watched, many from countries that were no longer Britain's to rule. The broadcast carried an unspoken truth. The British Empire had not vanished. It had transformed. The colonies were becoming nations, and Britain was learning what it meant to live without ownership. But the shadows of empire cast long, and the process of letting go was never clean. In the hills of Kenya, the Mau Mau rebellion burned like wildfire. The Kikuyu people, stripped of their land and dignity, rose up against colonial authorities. British troops responded with iron fists. Villages were destroyed, thousands detained in concentration camps, and stories of torture and mutilation haunted the countryside. To the world, the British government called it a state of emergency. To those who lived it, it was a war for freedom. In Cyprus, the battle for independence turned city streets into battlegrounds. Guerrilla fighters ambushed British soldiers in the night, and the empire answered with curfews, prisons, and executions. In Malaysia, jungles hid revolutionaries determined to end British control once and for all. The empire fought shadows, but every victory was temporary. The old world was collapsing, and no amount of order or law could hold it together. Meanwhile, inside Britain itself, the winds of change were blowing. Soldiers returned from war to find a country exhausted and divided. Rationing continued, industries struggled, and families who had sacrificed everything for victory wondered what it had all been for. The empire had made Britain rich, but now that wealth seemed to have vanished into thin air. In its place came immigrant men and women from Jamaica, India, Pakistan, and Africa, invited to help rebuild the nation they had once served as subjects. They arrived full of hope, only to be met with suspicion. They built the railways, the hospitals, and the buses. But to many, they were never truly seen as equals. The British Empire had ruled millions of people of color, yet Britain itself had never learned how to live with them. In the Caribbean, independence arrived to the sound of drums and hymns. Jamaica in 1962, Trinidad and Tobago the same year. The rhythm of reggae, calypso, and steel pan became the heartbeat of new nations. The empire that had once stolen their labor now danced to their songs. In Africa, the moment was even more profound. Ghana's independence in 1957 was a signal to the world that the colonial age was ending. Kwame Nkrumah stood before the crowds in Accra and declared, "At long last, the battle has ended, and Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever." Those words rippled through the continent like thunder. Nigeria, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia. One by one, the colonies declared themselves sovereign. Flags changed, anthems were sung, and for the first time in centuries, Africa began to speak in its own voice. But independence came with wounds that time could not easily heal. Borders drawn by British hands sliced through ethnic groups and ancient kingdoms. Resources were still controlled by foreign companies. The British had left, but their systems, political, economic, and cultural, remained embedded in the soil. The empire was gone, yet its structure lived on, hidden beneath new flags. Farther east, in the lush jungles of Southeast Asia, the story was no different. Malaya, once a crown colony, gained independence in 1957 under Tunku Abdul Rahman, who promised unity among Malays, Chinese, and Indians. Later, Singapore, led by the sharp and visionary Lee Kuan Yew, separated from Malaysia to forge its own destiny. For the first time, the empire's Asian colonies were thriving on their own terms, yet each bore the marks of British rule in their governments, their education systems, and even their architecture. The empire's influence had become invisible, a quiet force shaping the modern world long after the flags were lowered. Still, Britain refused to fade into irrelevance. The Commonwealth replaced the empire, a club of former colonies, united by history and trade, and by a promise of friendship rather than force. It was a clever illusion, one that let Britain maintain pride without power. The term empire was gone, but its spirit lingered in the corridors of diplomacy and finance. London's banks still profited from former colonies. Its museums still displayed the treasures looted from them. Its schools still taught children about empire as though it were a grand adventure rather than a warning. But memory has a way of fighting back. In the decades that followed, the sins of empire began to surface like old shipwrecks rising from the deep. Survivors of colonial wars spoke of the horrors they endured of beatings, starvation, and loss. In Ireland, the wounds left by centuries of occupation were reopened by the Troubles, a conflict that reminded Britain that even within its own islands, the ghosts of conquest had not been laid to rest. In the 1980s, a small war in the South Atlantic briefly revived the empire's pride. The Falklands, a cluster of remote islands near Argentina, became the center of a modern colonial dispute. Argentina invaded, claiming them as their own. Britain, led by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, sent a fleet to reclaim them. The war was swift and brutal. Hundreds died, and the British emerged victorious. The nation cheered, and Thatcher's government basked in renewed confidence. But behind the triumph was irony. Britain had fought to protect a colony while claiming to believe in the right of self-determination. The empire might have been gone, but its mindset had never truly left. At the same time, immigration from former colonies transformed Britain itself. London became a city of many tongues: Urdu, Yoruba, Punjabi, Caribbean, Creole. Markets sold spices from Delhi beside pastries from Kingston. The children of empire now walked the streets of the old imperial capital, living proof that the world Britain had once ruled had come home. Yet the tension between nostalgia and reality remained. Some still longed for the glory days of empire, unaware that those days had never been glorious for anyone but a few. By the 1990s, only one major colony remained Hong Kong, the glittering city Britain had taken from China after the Opium Wars. For 150 years, it had stood as a symbol of British dominance in Asia, a place of commerce, culture, and contradiction. But the lease on the territory was running out, and history was catching up. In 1997, under a humid summer sky, the British handed Hong Kong back to China. Rain fell as the Union Jack was lowered for the final time. The crowd was silent. Prince Charles stood beneath his umbrella, watching the flag descend. It was more than the end of a colonial administration. It was the end of an era. When the rain stopped, so did the empire. Yet even in death, it left its fingerprints everywhere. The modern world, its trade routes, languages, borders, and institutions still carried the empire's design. English became the global tongue. British law formed the backbone of countless nations. The railways, universities, and bureaucracies it built became the skeleton of entire countries. And for all the suffering it caused, it also connected a planet that had once been isolated. But connection is not absolution. The empire's legacy is not one of heroism, but of complexity of progress and plunder intertwined. For every invention it spread, it took something in return: resources, identity, autonomy. For every school it built, it silenced a language. For every bridge it constructed, it burned a culture. Today, the descendants of empire live in a world that still grapples with its shadow. In museums, the debate rages. Should stolen artifacts like the Benin bronzes or the Rosetta Stone be returned to their rightful homes? In classrooms, the question lingers. How should history remember the empire as a builder or as a destroyer? And in the streets, echoes of colonialism shape conversations about race, inequality, and identity. The empire may have died, but its heartbeat remains faint, distant, but unmistakable. In the quiet corners of old London, beneath statues of kings and admirals, the city still hums with ghosts. The same docks that once launched ships of conquest now receive ships of commerce. The same warehouses that stored sugar and silk now hold galleries and apartments. History has changed its clothes, but not its essence. The empire lives on not in flags or armies, but in the bones of the modern world. And so, as the sun truly sets on the empire that once spanned the globe, one final truth emerges. Empires do not end with defeat. They end with memory. They end when people remember the truth that was hidden beneath the myths, when nations begin to see themselves not as subjects or rulers, but as survivors. The British Empire began as a spark in the mind of a single king, grew into a fire that consumed continents, and faded into smoke carried by the winds of time. But smoke leaves a scent. It lingers long after the flame is gone. And maybe, just maybe, that's what history really is. Not the rise or fall of empires, but the lingering smell of what they left behind. Empires often die twice, once in reality, and once in the stories people tell about them. The British Empire was no exception. For centuries, Britain had written its own story, a tale of explorers and heroes, of order and civilization. But after the empire's fall, the pen slipped from its hand. The colonies it once ruled began to write their own histories, and what they wrote was very different from the versions printed in English textbooks. To those who lived under its rule, the empire was not a beacon of light, but a shadow. It was the reason families starved during the Bengal famine of 1943, while British officials hoarded grain. It was why entire generations in Africa grew up under foreign flags, taught to see themselves as lesser. It was why indigenous children in Australia and Canada were taken from their parents, forced to abandon their languages, and stripped of their identities in the name of assimilation. These were not isolated tragedies. They were the architecture of empire, the cost of keeping the machine running. And yet, even as the empire's injustices became known, nostalgia persisted. Some still longed for the good old days, imagining an age of adventure and unity. But nostalgia is selective. It remembers the flags, not the chains. It remembers the ships, not the bodies they carried. It remembers the speeches of victory, not the cries of the conquered. The truth is more complicated and more human. The empire was built not by monsters, but by people who believed they were doing the right thing. Kings and queens convinced themselves that they were chosen to rule. Merchants convinced themselves they were spreading trade. Missionaries convinced themselves they were saving souls. But in the spaces between their intentions, greed crept in, power corrupted, and soon belief became justification. In the end, the empire was a mirror of its creators, brilliant, flawed, ambitious, and blind to its own reflection. After the Second World War, Britain entered a new age, one of reflection and reckoning. The Cold War shifted the balance of power across the globe, and Britain was forced to find a new role in a world that no longer revolved around it. The United States and the Soviet Union divided the planet into the rival spheres of influence, leaving Britain to navigate between them. The once mighty empire now relied on diplomacy, culture, and finance to maintain relevance. And somehow, it worked. The empire's legacy evolved into something softer, but no less powerful influence, through language, media, and education. The BBC's voice reached every corner of the world. Shakespeare was taught in classrooms from Lagos to Lahore. London became a center for banking and art, attracting people from the very nations it once ruled. It was no longer an empire of land, but of mind. But the ghosts remained. The descendants of colonized peoples began to question the empire's lasting hold. They saw how its hierarchies still shaped modern society, how wealth, opportunity followed old colonial lines. They saw how the same countries that had been plundered were now trapped in cycles of debt and dependence. The empire might have ended, but the system it created still existed. In recent years, a quiet movement began not to erase history, but to confront it. Statues of slave traders and colonial generals were toppled. Debates erupted in universities over how empire should be remembered. Should Britain apologize? Should reparations be paid? Or should the past simply be left behind? There are no easy answers, but perhaps that's the point. Empires don't offer closure. They leave questions that echo through time, haunting every generation that inherits their consequences. And yet, amid the ruins of empire, something remarkable happened. From the nations once ruled by Britain came voices that changed the world. Writers, artists, musicians, and thinkers from former colonies redefined culture itself. Chinua Achebe, Salman Rushdie, Derek Walcott, Arundhati Roy, and countless others told their own stories not of empire, but of endurance. Reggae, Bhangra, Afrobeat, and Caribbean jazz filled the airwaves that once carried the British national anthem. The empire's greatest irony was that in trying to shape the world in its image, it ended up creating a world that reshaped it instead. The children of empire scattered across continents grew into global citizens, their cultures intertwined in London, Toronto, and Sydney. What was once imposed became shared. What was once stolen became transformed. The empire's legacy was no longer a crown or a flag. It was the undeniable fact that the world had become connected. But connection has a cost. Today, many former colonies still bear the marks of exploitation, poverty, corruption, instability wounds that trace back to the lines drawn on maps in faraway rooms. The languages, borders, and governments left behind were not designed for the people who inherited them. They were designed for control. To this day, those old designs shape conflict and politics. From Nigeria to India, from the Middle East to the Caribbean, echoes of empire still dictate the rhythm of life. It is a haunting paradox. The empire that once sought to dominate the world also created the blueprint for globalization, the same interconnectedness that now defines the 21st century. Every email sent, every trade deal signed, every English word spoken, all carry the fingerprints of history. And so the empire lives on not as a government, but as a ghost, woven into the very fabric of modern civilization. In the quiet corners of London, the monuments still stand. Marble kings, bronze admirals, and stone soldiers gaze down at the crowds passing below, their faces weathered but unrepentant. The Thames flows past them like time itself, indifferent to what it has witnessed. The city that once ruled the world now hums with 1,000 languages, its people the living mosaic of a past that can't be erased. Sometimes, late at night, when the fog rolls over the river and the lights of Westminster flicker, you can almost hear it, the echo of a ship's horn, the distant murmur of sailors speaking in tongues from every corner of the earth. It's the sound of history reminding Britain that its empire was not just a dream of power, but a story of people, millions of them, whose lives built the foundation of modernity. Empires rise to conquer, but what they truly leave behind is connection, fragile, complicated, and permanent. From the highlands of Scotland to the villages of Ghana, from the deserts of Rajasthan to the streets of Kingston,
there are traces of a shared, tangled past. A past of pain and pride, of invention and injustice, of creation and destruction. Maybe that's the truth of empire. It's never just one thing. It's everything: the beauty and the horror, the innovation and the cruelty, the civilization and the collapse. As the centuries turn and new powers rise, the lesson remains: no empire lasts forever, but the marks they leave can shape forever itself. The British Empire began with a king fighting Vikings in the fog of ancient England. It expanded through oceans, deserts, and jungles, carried by men who believed the world could belong to them. It reached its peak when the sun shone on red lands from Canada to Australia, from India to Africa. And it ended not with a battle, but with silence, a lowering of flags, a signing of papers, a sigh of exhaustion. Yet even in its end, it left behind the world we know. A world bound by invisible threads, trade routes, language, technology, and culture, all tracing back to a small island that once believed it could rule the earth. And maybe in some strange way it still does, not through conquest, but through legacy. Through the laws we use, the words we speak, the ideas we share. The empire turned to dust, but its shadow remains long, complex, and impossible to ignore. In every story of power lies a warning. The British Empire believed it was eternal. It believed that destiny itself had chosen it to rule. But time humbles even the greatest empires. The ocean that carried its ships now carries the echoes of its fall. The nations it once conquered now stand as equals, their flags bright against the sky once claimed by Britain alone. And so, as the tide rolls in along the shores of Dover and the bells of London toll at dusk, the question lingers like a whisper in the wind, not of what the empire conquered, but of what it became. Because the British Empire didn't just change the world. It became the world.